And because then the British Museum really tried to hide what was going on, because the protocols didn't allow for asking questions later on, then that led to this announcement, this arrogant kind of an announcement. Hey, we have determined that this cloth, allegedly being the shroud, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, is now false, and we've proved it. That would not have happened.
Well, Guy Powell, welcome, and it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, Jordan, great to be here. Thank you so much.
For those who might not be too familiar with you and your work, can you kind of talk a bit about what you do? I guess what your relationship with the Shroud of Turin is.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, probably about 20 years ago, I started trying to understand a little bit more about the shroud. I had heard about it from some of the research that had been done over the, even in 1978. I remember seeing a Time magazine article or something on the research that was done on it. And then I remember in 1988 there was some radiocarbon testing that was done, and I remember reading that, and I go, oh, so it's been proven to be a fraud. And but about 20 years ago, my brother gave me this book on the shroud, and I said, "Oh, that is really interesting." It was a history book, and I said, "What needs to happen on this is that somebody needs to write a historical fiction." And so what I actually wrote, like the first chapter, a first draft of the first chapter, right then and there, and on that weekend, and then it sat there for a while as I learned more, and kind of, life got in the way and stuff like that. And then COVID hit, and I said, I am going to start writing that book, and actually that's what came out of it. So The Only Witness, a history of the Shroud of Turin. And what it does is it talks about the shroud a little bit, but really it's a historical fiction. So it puts you right into the story over the last 2,000 years of the different major events that took place surrounding the shroud. And it's a good read. It's a Christian read. It's a Christian story. And I believe that the shroud is to like 99% the actual and authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And then the book basically, follows that history along as to what may have happened to it over the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach, because obviously there's a lot of books written about the shroud, and there might be, other fictional works, but this is the first one, at least that I've heard of, where it takes that approach. And I feel like the Shroud of Turin is just, and the history of it and the whole story surrounding it, just what it is, or at least what it very well might be, kind of just begs to have many stories told about it. And so I think that sounds like something that would be worth the audience checking out. So your book, is that available on Amazon, or do you have that on a website where I can maybe point people to?
Yeah, absolutely. It's available on Amazon, or you can go to guypowell.com. Guypowell.com, and you can read up a little bit about the book, and then it'll point you over to Amazon to buy it online. And you could certainly order it from bookstores and things like that, but really nowadays the easiest thing is to just buy it online, and you can get it in Kindle or or in print, whatever best way you'd like to do it. And I think to your point about the shroud, it's it's kind of a there's a lot of interesting emotions that come out of that. On one hand, you have the shroud as being kind of the proof, potentially, that the Gospels wrote up this story of this person that absolutely truly existed, and then affected the lives of billions of people here on the earth. And on the other hand, you go, well, I don't need proof to have my faith. I believe in Jesus regardless of whether I have proof. And so, it definitely, has that emotion to it as well. And for me as well, I didn't need the Shroud of Turin to say, hey, I believe in Jesus and as my Savior and Redeemer. I already had that faith. But the shroud is kind of one of those interesting things that certainly a scientific and archaeological kind of a piece of history, and then of course it's kind of nice to say, yeah, and it does really reflect the Gospels in a very big way.
Yeah, I found, and I don't know if this is your experience as well, but with my very limited, my experience with the Shroud goes back about a year at this point when I started actually kind of looking more into it. But when I've had different conversations, or even when I've shared about it on social media or done interviews or put out videos, I've only put a couple out at this point. But when I do put those out, I guess it seems that a lot of people might kind of think of the Shroud. I guess the secular world might think of it as some weird thing that Christians get hung up on. But I found that actually the majority of Christians I encounter are highly skeptical of the Shroud and very disinterested in learning more about it or even giving it the time of day. And so I can relate to that as well, because up to, again, about a year ago, I was kind of in that same boat. I've heard a handful of things about it. I might have seen an article, going in the grocery store line about maybe on a tabloid or something like that. And so you sort of just get this idea that the Shroud of Turin kind of belongs in the realm of ghosts and aliens and weird, Bigfoot and things like that, but it's not something to really take seriously. And so I think that's kind of where a lot of, at least in my experience, it seems like a lot of Christians kind of land in that position in the way that they think about the Shroud, is that there really isn't any substance to it. There isn't really any reason to take it seriously. And so I guess that's, for somebody like yourself who devotes a lot of time in to the Shroud of Turin and to this topic. I guess one thing that I was curious about is just what is it about the Shroud that for you personally, I guess, kind of took you from, maybe putting it in that realm of like tabloid sort of, strange, bizarre thing that's not worth taking seriously to, oh, this is very much worth taking seriously. What is it about the Shroud, I guess, that did that for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think just stepping back 1 second, there's probably 2 or 3 different types of, I don't know, like Christians, I guess, as it relates to the Shroud. I think the Catholics are probably more interested in following the Shroud because there is a belief in relics and things like that, and certainly going back hundreds and thousands of years, the relics did play a very important part in it. So there is a lot of value in that. Then you have the Protestants, and they kind of break themselves into 2 groups. I think the one group kind of says, hey, I don't need any of those relics. It doesn't matter to me what it is. I have my faith, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that, and I don't need that. And by the way, it's been proven to be false, so why even worry about it? So there's that group, and then there's maybe a smaller group that are Protestants that also kind of believe in the Shroud. That yes, it is it is possibly, maybe very possibly the burial cloth of Jesus. So I think they kind of I think there's those 3 groups. I probably would have fallen into. I'm a Protestant. I'm a Methodist, and so I probably would have fallen into the first group, especially after the radiocarbon dating that was done in 1988, and said, "Yo, yeah, it's false anyway. So why do I even care?" And then as I started to read about it, my brother sent me this book, as I mentioned, and I started reading about it, and I go, "Wow, this is really interesting." And then I read more, and I read more, and I read more, and then now I'm convinced that it is, probably to 99% chance that it is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So it was probably that one book that kind of really tickled my fancy, and as I read it, it really started to, to bring things together in terms of my belief about the shroud, not about Christianity, but my belief about the shroud.
Yeah. And I think it really kind of takes that. It takes kind of diving into it a little bit and reading something like a book or, because there's a lot of different pieces of evidence, a lot of different information surrounding it that you can't, it'd probably be hard to kind of nail down, oh, well, it was this one piece of information that really convinced me to take it seriously. I think it's worth people kind of giving it a little bit of time, because there's really an overwhelming amount of science in all different fields surrounding it, and different research that can be looked into. But I suppose what might be helpful here, I'm assuming most people that will watch this will know what the Shroud is, but maybe just real quick, can you explain what is the Shroud of Turin?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back to the four Gospels, you have obviously Jesus walking down the Via Dolorosa to Calvary to be crucified on the cross. He's taken down from the cross. He's definitely dead. He's been stabbed on the side. He had blood flowing in a big way out the side. At his side, you have scourge marks all over his body. You have the nail piercings on his wrists and on his feet as he was being held on the cross. And then he's taken down. He's buried in the tomb. And that's where the shroud as a cloth really first appears, in that, and I don't remember the exact words, but Joseph of Arimathea takes the body down and buries, Jesus's body in his tomb with a cloth that he had acquired. And then the women come the next, the Sunday, so that was Friday, now the Sunday. The women come on the Friday morning and they see that the tomb is open. They go running back and tell Peter and John. Peter and John come running to the tomb. They look in the tomb and they see the cloths lying there. And one of those cloths is believed to be the Shroud of Turin, as we now understand it. One of the other cloths was a thing that went over his head to capture and keep the blood with him, and that's called the sudarium, or the face cloth. And so those two cloths are mentioned in the Gospels. And so that story that I just told in a handful of words is basically in all four Gospels in some form or another. John probably does the best at describing then the tomb scene, and then Peter running into the tomb, John kind of waiting outside. And one of the nice things about John, when he finally looks in, he sees, and right in John it says he sees and he saw and believed, and that's really kind of this first statement that you see in the Gospels of the disciples truly understanding what they just witnessed, and the ministry that they had just experienced with Jesus, and now then this witness on that the empty tomb, and they saw, and then they finally, and John says, I saw and I finally believed. And so the shroud is that cloth, or believed to be that cloth. Now it's believed to have been that it was wrapped, the body it was lying on the tables or the platform in the tomb, and they placed the body on top of that cloth, and then they wrapped it over his head, and then over his feet again, and then they probably wrapped it up to tie the cloth around the body and to keep the body covered. That is the shroud, and that is what we're talking about. Now, what's interesting then is what happened to it afterward, and that's kind of what my book talks about. And it goes potentially up to Antioch. It goes potentially up to Edessa, which is modern-day Eastern Turkey. It goes to Constantinople, which was the capital of the Roman Empire. It actually never goes to Rome, surprisingly, even though Rome, was certainly an important city at the time. It goes to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine or the Roman Empire. It goes maybe to Athens, and then it goes up to France, where it finally then reappears with what we would call historical documentation, where it's written about and there's multiple sources. And in the 1350s, it actually appears in France. And then it eventually makes its way down to Turin, Italy. And Turin is in northern Italy. It's in the Savoy, what's called the Savoy part of Italy. And the Savoy part then is what's actually then the recent modern kings of Italy in that family, as they were, the royal family in the Italian line of royalty. And so then they own it. They owned it at the time, and they owned it for about 500 years. And that's then kind of the history. The interesting thing is the documented history starting in 1350 in France, in Lille, France. And then there's all kinds of little references here and there throughout different pieces of writing that could be interpreted, can be interpreted, are interpreted as being references to the Shroud. And there's even another reference in the Bible, in Paul. And Paul relates to the Shroud in Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "Oh, you foolish Galatians," I don't remember the exact wording, but "you have seen an image of the risen Christ." And that's kind of the way these references often work, is that's kind of what appears to be a possible reference to the Shroud. You have seen an image of the risen Christ. And so that's one of them that goes all the way potentially back to the Bible. There's other ones that that you can find throughout history over the next 1,300 years until it reaches Lille, France, where it is very specifically wrote up in the in historical documentation as being there in roughly the 1350s.
So we have the gospel accounts, which, if they are accurately relaying to us what happened to the body of Jesus after he was crucified, he was wrapped in a cloth. Now we have, at least at this point in history, the Catholic Church has in its possession a cloth that is believed by some to be the very same cloth that Jesus' body was wrapped in. I guess what a lot of people might wonder, and maybe talk a bit about, what is it about the Shroud of Turin specifically, that cloth, that would lead people to believe that this is the authentic burial cloth of Christ? What is it about the cloth? What do we find on the shroud that leads many people to that conclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of maybe two trains of thinking. There's one is that it is the authentic cloth, and how can you prove that it is? What kind of evidence do we have? And then there's the ones that say, no, it's a medieval forgery. And then, so there's kind of theories going along that way. The theories that I kind of think of are of the shroud being the true burial cloth of Jesus. There's a handful of scientific testing that's been done. There's archaeological and historical references that also, fit in with the story. There's also evidence that how could a forger, a 13th, 14th century forger, actually have known about all of these different things related to burial and related to the human body, human anatomy, and a whole bunch of other things that are kind of proof that it couldn't be a forgery. And so one thing, for example, is there's, which I really find fascinating, is there was a criminologist, Dr. Max Fry, and he had studied pollen. And he basically, as he was trying to solve crimes, try to understand, what pollen was found on the body. And so he started to build up a catalog of pollen. And then he was asked and was part of some of the scientific studies of the shroud. And he found interesting samples of pollen on the shroud, on the cloth itself. So, for example, he found pollen that was found on specific plants that come from the Palestine area, so modern day, Jerusalem. He found specific pollen that came from Turkey, so that from plants that are found in Turkey and only found in Turkey, and so then it must have been in Constantinople. And then he found pollen that was on it that's specific to Southern Europe. And so if you take those three pieces of evidence, how would a forger know to actually go to Jerusalem and capture pollen, go to Turkey and capture pollen, go to Southern Europe and capture pollen, and sprinkle it across the cloth? So it's kind of one of those maybe a negative proof that yes, the pollen is something that's there, and yes, this makes sense, and that's why then a forger would probably never get it right. The second thing is there are blood stains specific to a crucifixion. As I mentioned, there's blood that's on the wrists, on the image, and on the cloth in the places where you'd expect the wrists to be. And then you have the on the feet, and then you have the side, and then you have also a bunch of wounds from a body that has been scourged, has been whipped, has been beaten, and you see all of that. And those things right there are written about in the Bible, in the Gospels, and then here they are, they're found on the cloth. And then I haven't even mentioned the best one is the image that's actually on the shroud. The image on the shroud has some very unique properties to it. So first of all, there is a photograph, almost a photographic image of a body, a crucified body on a cloth. And if it was a forged cloth, a forged image, how would they have known to have made that image on the cloth? Now, the image itself has some very unique characteristics to it. One is that it's three-dimensional, or it encodes three-dimensional information, and because of that, then when you put the image itself through an image analyzer, and I'll talk about that, it actually shows the three-dimensional body and face of a human. You can actually see then it looks like, the three-dimensional, you can see the mustache, the nose, the eyes being a little bit lower, the forehead being a little bit higher, and things like that. The other thing about the image is that it's only on the surface, the minuscule little surface of each of the fibers, of each of the fibrils, of each of the fibers of the actual thread that's in the linen cloth. And so then how would a forger know how to imprint that kind of information into the cloth? The last one is definitely not a paint. With paint, you would see paint flows. You would see, because paint is a liquid, you would see flows. There are no flows. If it was painted, if you had folded the cloth, the paint would crack after a long time. There's no cracking or anything like that. It's not a dye. It's not a paint. None of those things. None of those things kind of come through, and have been proven scientifically that it's not a paint. It's not a dye. It's not a scorch. It's not a handful of other methods that someone might use to make a cloth. And then one other thing on the image itself is that it's really a negative. So, nowadays when we take a picture with our iPhone, we see a positive image. We see, Guy, and we see Jordan, we see our faces, we see our shirts, and we see them in the colors that we perceive them today. However, it used to be that film, you had to do a negative first. So you would imprint the image on film. You would then process that image. It would turn out to be a black and white image, or maybe at some point it was color, but it was a negative. So where there were whites over here, there were blacks over there, and where there were light grays over here, there were dark grays over there. And the image that's on the shroud is more of a negative than it is a positive. And that was only discovered in 1898. And the concept of a negative really didn't even exist prior till the invention of photography. So how could a 13th century forger have known about negative images and things like that? And how could that forger have painted in a negative? And how could that forger have painted in a negative in a three-dimensional way? It strains incredulity, I think is the term. So there's a
Yes.
lot of proof
Yeah.
that it really is a something that's unusual that couldn't have been made by a 13th century forger.
So obviously, one of the big debates that you've kind of touched on already surrounding the shroud is the age of it. Because obviously, if you can prove that it originates in the Middle Ages, then obviously it cannot be the authentic burial cloth of Christ, because it needs to have a date that would go back to the first century, to the time of Christ. And so, a lot of the debate centers around how old is the cloth, which is where the radiocarbon dating and all the fiascos that have kind of surrounded that kind of come into play. But can you talk a bit about the measurements and the things that were done
Yeah.
to indicate the age of the shroud?
Yeah. So there have been probably 20 or 30, and there's always more studies that kind of show that the age of the shroud is somewhere around the first century, plus or minus a couple hundred years, depending upon the accuracy of the actual methodology used. And now, one of what people kind of believe is the gold standard for archaeological dating is this method called radiocarbon dating. And radiocarbon dating was invented by Walter Libby at the University of Chicago. And what he found was that in the atmosphere, there are there's multiple, but there's two main kinds of carbon. There's what's called carbon 14 and carbon 12. Carbon 14 is constantly being regenerated by the rays of the sun hitting the atmosphere. And so there's always kind of a constant level of carbon 14 in the atmosphere. And then there's carbon 12, which is the stable version of carbon. And so that doesn't change at all. The problem is that carbon 14 decays. And it has a very specific half-life. If those of you that have studied anything in physics, that the term half-life means that half of it will decay into something else in that half-life. And the half-life of carbon 14 is in like the 5,000 years, 5,300, if I remember correctly. And so if I know that there's always a constant amount of carbon 14 in the air, and plants are ingesting this as part of their photosynthesis, then they will ingest carbon 14 and carbon 12 while they are alive, based on whatever that amount is in the atmosphere. But unfortunately, as soon as they die, they don't ingest any more carbon, and so then the carbon 14 begins to decay. And it's that decay of now the ratio of the carbon 14 to the carbon 12 that can help you to kind of determine what the age of the shroud is. And so then radiocarbon dating was invented to start to try and date things, archaeological finds, and it's been used on a lot of different things. But you have to be very, very careful with it. And so it's been, because it can be very accurate, and this ratio is very mathematically sound, and you can measure it. Then it's kind of gets the moniker of being the gold standard for dating. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things that can go wrong, but nevertheless, in 1988, there was a study done on the shroud. A single sample was taken off the shroud. It was cut into 3 pieces, and it was given to 3 laboratories, and they basically went off and ran this radiocarbon dating on the shroud, and they came out with a date with some error in it. They said it dates anywhere from 1260 AD to 1390 AD. And that then, of course, is the Middle Ages. It kind of ties with the Middle Ages forgery, and then all of a sudden, work on the shroud, really stopped. Then over the years, there were quite a few things going on as well. Wait a minute now. We have 20 tests over here that point to the shroud being from the 1st century, and we have one over here that points to it being from 1260 to 1390. So what went wrong? And or what went right. And so then there has been a lot of research and understanding of the radiocarbon dating, and then that research has led to basically being able to debunk the radiocarbon dating, and I'll talk about that. But one of the things I wanted to bring out, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk today, was that article really gave the shroud a bad name. Number one, it really stopped in a big way a lot of the research that was done on the shroud. And then it was published, an article was published in Nature magazine in February 1989 that talked about this 1988 radiocarbon dating. And that was supposedly peer reviewed. And one of the things that that was kind of the instigation for this call was to talk about pushing a petition to have the Nature magazine retract that article. So what went wrong on the dating? And there's a couple of really good videos out there. There's one from Michael Kowalski. He's the president of the British the BSTS, the British Society of the Turin Shroud, and he put a really good video together, and he talks about what went wrong in that dating. Well, first of all, the biggest thing was that they wanted to take samples of the shroud from different areas. Now, one of the things that you could imagine is that if people are handling the shroud in one particular spot over thousands of years, hundreds of times, maybe even thousands of times as they're displaying it, that area would get contaminated and potentially need repair. So you would want to take a sample not from just that area, but a couple of different areas, so you'd have a way to check to make sure that the age of what we're taking has not been contaminated or repaired or something like that. So the original method was to have actually 7 laboratories checking 3 different areas on the shroud, and then splitting each of those samples up so that the 7 laboratories would use and date this piece of cloth using their different methods. And there were actually 2 different radiocarbon dating methods originally in the specification. And then you would want to have that supervised by an independent authority. In this case, it was the British Museum. And now, unfortunately, what happened was that they only chose 3 labs. They only chose one carbon dating method, and it was supervised by the British Museum. And they only took a sample from one area. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things that I won't go into, but there's a whole bunch of other things that went wrong in that dating protocol. Well, one of the biggest things that then came out of this was, as I mentioned, the dating of 1260 to 1390. What they didn't say was that there was statistical challenges to the way that they did the statistics on the numbers. Now, I don't know about you, Jordan, but I took statistics in high school and in college, and I hated it. I just couldn't figure it out. It didn't make any sense to me. Well, all of a sudden, here is now a real-life example of how statistics can mess up or can kind of hide what's going on. So it turned out that the statistics actually showed that there's what's called a systematic bias. And that is, as you move closer and closer from the feet, closer and closer to the head, the age actually starts to go down. So it goes from, let's say, 1260 when you're near the feet, 1390 when you're near the ankle. And if you then project that out, extrapolate that out, you would find that if you got to the area around the head, the dating of the cloth around the head would be some point in the future. And all of a sudden, statistics, that thing that we all hated in college, now comes into play, and you go, well, how can that be? Well, that was covered up. Well, let me say allegedly covered up by the British Museum and then the powers that be that were involved in that. And it was either covered up or they didn't see it. Hard to believe that they didn't see it. So they made a whole bunch of little errors like that, and they all kind of come out now to where you can clearly say and convincingly say that the radiocarbon dating has now been debunked. That date no longer applies, and that the other dates, the other methods, are more appropriate to actually dating the shroud. I know that was a long answer, but hopefully that made sense.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting things there. So I guess one question would be why didn't they follow the proper procedure? Because it sounds like from kind of the get-go of doing the carbon-14 testing that they kind of started off on the entirely wrong foot. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the STIRP team, the team of scientists who were allowed time with the shroud, weren't they kind of pushing for this procedure of sampling 3 different areas and all these things you described that originally was supposed to be how it was done? So I guess why was it that wasn't followed? Do we know why that choice was made?
Yeah, and I would say almost absolutely we know exactly why. Of course, there's certain things that never got documented, and they're behind the scenes. One of the things that really happened is, and we're right now in the middle of politics here in the U.S. with the elections coming, but politics was at a whole different level when this radiocarbon dating protocol was being defined. Originally, STIRP absolutely in 1978 when they did their testing, they said yes, we absolutely have to radiocarbon date the shroud. We want to do that. We want to run it, but let's agree to the protocol first. And Joe Marino, who is one of the well-known writers on the shroud, he wrote this book, the 1988 C14 dating of the Shroud of Turin, a stunning expose up here. And what's interesting about that is the politics in there. These scientists over here didn't like those scientists. These scientists over here were religious this way, and those are religious that way. These are atheists. Those are not. The politics was just incredible. So up until about 6 months or so prior to the actual sampling of the shroud, where they actually cut the pieces out of the shroud, there was pretty much agreement on the protocol. And that protocol, like I mentioned, is on the bstsnewsletter.com site from Michael Kowalski. And he goes through then what that protocol was and all of the things that everybody really kind of agreed to doing. And then all of a sudden, within like the day of testing, everything changed. And and it's really a shame. So they went from the 7 labs down to the 3 labs. They went from 2 different carbon dating methods down to 1. They went from 3 samples down to 1 area, et cetera, et cetera. Everything changed. And it's that last minute change that everybody just couldn't believe it. And then, as I mentioned, then of course the statistics done by the museum also had their challenges as well, and in terms of how they handled the statistics, how they handled the reporting and the numbers and stuff like that. Really kind of fascinating.
So what would you predict, we're now 35 about years removed from the carbon-14 dating, and as you've talked about, the impact that's had on shroud research and the impact that it's had on just the public perception of the shroud. I personally, and my perception, and I'm sure so many others can relate to this, have been our views of the shroud and just my own personal dismissal of it for so many years, probably in large part comes back to, the results of that testing. And so I guess, what would you predict would have happened had they correctly, had they taken the 3 samples, had they, sent these samples to the 7 labs rather than the way they did it? Do you think we would have come up with a different date? Do you think it would have dated to the 1st century? What do you predict there?
Yeah, I think there would have been multiple dates. I think one of the fun things that happens with the Shroud is that everything that you investigate leads to more questions. And so I think what would have happened is, had they followed the protocol, they would have said, wow, look at that. The one sample over here gives us a date of 1260 to 1390. This sample over here gives us some other date, and that sample over there gives us maybe some other date. And that would have led to more questions. Because if there was no contamination, if there was no repair, or if there was some other mechanism going on, then if all of those were not happening, then you would expect that if the Shroud was authentic, that all of the answers would be exactly the same. They'd be around the 1st century, and you go, oh, okay, great. If those answers are now different, whatever those differences are, that then says, hey, there's something we're missing here. We need to investigate further. And because then the British Museum really tried to hide what was going on, because the protocols didn't allow for asking questions later on, then that led to this announcement, this arrogant kind of an announcement. Hey, we have determined that this cloth, allegedly being the shroud, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, is now false, and we've proved it. That would not have happened. What would have happened is the results may have disagreed, maybe they agreed, and then it would have led to more questions. And that's actually what is so much fun about the scientific method, is you do testing, you follow a certain protocol. When you get to the answers and you get them as best as possible, and you find things that just don't work out, you go, oh, well, let's figure out what went wrong there. And maybe there's some other mechanism that we're just totally missing. And then that leads to more research and what have you. What happened, though, I think, and this is unfortunate, is that because this came out with the answer 1260 to 1390, the church said, well, wait a minute now, this is not good. Let's not allow any more testing on this. And so unfortunately now the Shroud, there's been very, very little testing on it since 1988. And everybody wants to do another radiocarbon testing of the Shroud and figure out what went wrong. There's a handful of theories now as to why the dates came out the way they did. And there's some really good stories, I think, that follow that testing, that show a plausible reason why they didn't come out. So I think that's really what's kind of interesting moving forward.
So, as you mentioned earlier, one of the things that we wanted to discuss, and the purpose of this video was to talk about the petition that you're kind of leading to get Nature magazine to retract that article. So can you kind of talk a bit about that petition and,
Sure.
and what you're attempting to accomplish with it?
Yeah, the link to the petition is guypowell.com/petition. Nice and easy, guypowell.com/petition. So the radiocarbon dating has been convincingly debunked. There's Joe's book. There's a handful of, when you go to that site, guypowell.com/petition, you'll see a handful of resources listed there that clearly indicate that there were that the radiocarbon testing that was done was incorrect, and so if it's correct, and if a scientific journal like Nature magazine wants to maintain its reputation, and that they published an article on this specific result, and they said it was peer reviewed, and now it has been debunked, then for their own scientific stature and their own ability to promote what's really truly believed, peer-reviewed and as correct as possible research, then they have to retract this article because it really and truly has been at least debunked based on all of the scientists that I've talked about, all of the papers that have been listed, and so therefore they have to, if they want to maintain their integrity, they have to retract that. Now, of course, there's been a lot of water under the bridge. 1988, as you mentioned, is about 35 years ago. So now what this petition is to basically get them to at least review the evidence and potentially either write an addendum to the article or to fully retract it. Either way would be a step in the right direction, given especially that there is so much evidence of the problems with the dating. Now, the good news is just recently, and this was kind of the impetus for this petition at this time, was that they just retracted 2 other articles written by a scientist that clearly had done some fraudulent things in terms of the scientific method that he used, and those were then uncovered, and so then they actually retracted those articles. Well, here we have an article in a similar way. Whether they did it fraudulently or not, that's not the point. What the point is that the results have now been proven to be erroneous, and therefore that article needs to be, at a minimum, appended. At a maximum, it needs to be retracted. And that's what the petition is all about. Again, the petition can be found at guypowell.com /petition.
Yeah. And I'll definitely make sure to include a link in the video description below as well. So what, I guess, is there other evidence that would point to the radiocarbon dating that was done being erroneous? Are there other things in that arena that you'd want to mention?
Yeah, sure. And like I said, Michael Kowalski did a great thing. His video is called The Shroud of Turin, 1988 Carbon Dating, Triumph or Travesty. And one of the things as well, one of the things, so we had one sample cut. It was divided into 3 subsamples. Each of those 3 subsamples were sent to 3 different labs: Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford. Each of those labs cut those pieces down into 3 or 4 sub pieces, and so then they tested and dated each one of those. And most likely, the dates that they came up with were correct. I don't think necessarily that they did anything wrong in their methodology, and especially because they're reasonably close to each other. It's then, why did the answer come up to be, somewhere in the 13th to 14th century? Were those samples not properly cleaned, or were they repaired with modern material? And then, of course, when they sent in their results, there was actually a protocol defined which they didn't follow in terms of what the results were going to be, and then that protocol, or then that result, then led to errors, significant errors in the way that the statistics were handled. So, for example, one of them was kind of funny. There was a margin of error on the Arizona samples, and the margin of error was 4.176. Now, everybody knows, I guess probably from the 3rd or 4th grade, the way you round that number is, 4.176 should be rounded down to 4. And I think we learned that in 3rd grade, maybe 4th grade or so. Instead, the British Museum rounded it up to 5. How could you do that? Just little things like that. You go, how could you make a mistake like that? Was that a cover-up? Was that an alleged cover-up, or what is that? The other thing that they had in the protocol as well, and I'll stop after this example, was that they had the sample cut, and then they were provided an additional control sample from some other cloth. And unfortunately, the way that they were marked and the way that they were packaged, it was pretty obvious which ones came from the shroud and which ones came from I think it was an Egyptian mummy. Now, the original protocol was to somehow make those control samples disguised so that you couldn't tell which one was the shroud and which one wasn't. And secondly, they were supposed to have two control samples, not just one. And so then there were some challenges with how those samples were packaged so that they wouldn't be identified. And then the labs would only be able to say, hey, sample one, had a date of 1260. Sample two had a date of something else. Sample three had a date of something else. We don't know which one is the true shroud or which one is, something else. And then it was only the British Museum that was supposed to, do then the math and the statistics. And unfortunately, that was also not properly designed and followed.
So you had these control samples where those actually performing the testing they shouldn't have known with the samples that were before them which one was actually from the cloth. So that was to prevent any possible bias in the testing. And you're saying that really didn't come into play because of whatever errors there were in the testing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, you've heard of this term blind testing, and when they do drug testing, it's a double blind test, where the person administering the test and the person receiving the tablet doesn't know, both of those people don't know which ones are the true drug versus the placebo. And that double blind testing is kind of what they were trying to follow here as well, so that you'd have a blind, understanding. Because it could have been that the 1260 cloth was the control, not the actual sample, so that then when they report it, they wouldn't know which one was which, and so that would then make it so that they were giving the best results possible. And the second thing too was that after they got done with the results, the labs were not supposed to communicate with each other, and unfortunately they did. And so, then they said, oh yeah, we found this date, you found that date, and they weren't supposed to say that. And so that wasn't followed either. So, there are a handful of little things in terms of how all of these pieces come together incorrectly, leading to a result that just can't be fully believed and relied upon.
Yeah. It sounds like there's a lot of reasons to not put a whole lot of stock into the carbon-14 dating. And unfortunately, it's really been the opposite. There's been so much weight put on that, to the extent, again, that the shroud has been widely considered to have been debunked or proven to be non-authentic. So is there any other evidence, apart from the carbon-14 testing? It would be great to have another, properly done test on the shroud, and hopefully that can happen in the future. But is there other evidence surrounding the shroud that would indicate a earlier first century date? Yeah. Is there anything that you would want to point to that would, at least indicate that it's older than what the carbon-14 suggests?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go through that quickly before we break. But so as part of some of the research that's been done, there's a chemist. His name is Ray Rogers, and he did some chemical testing on the linen fibers themselves. Now, the linen fibers decay over time. And when they decay, the chemicals or the proteins that are in the linen decay from one thing down to another. So in linen and in a lot of plant material, there is this chemical called lignin, and then there's another chemical called vanillin, and there's a ratio that you can get of the vanillin and the lignin there's no vanillin in the lignin. So what happens is the vanillin decays over time as well, similar to how the carbon-14 decays. The vanillin decays as well. Now, the vanillin, though, because it's chemical, its decay is much more dependent upon the temperature of where the shroud was stored. So if it's stored at, let's say, 100 degrees, it might decay faster. If it's stored at 20 degrees, it might decay slower. So there's a lot more error in using this decay rate of the vanillin, because there's no documentation of exactly how and where the shroud was stored and at what temperature and things like that. But nevertheless, on that particular test, then he's able to, reasonably accurately claim that the shroud is older than 1,500 years, as I recall. And so it gets the shroud material, the linen fiber in the shroud material, all the way back down to a roughly 500 AD. And then after that, the inaccuracies of the testing and the inaccuracies of the environment around around how the shroud was stored now come into play, and you can't get any better number than that. But at least it gets you back to 1,500 or so, and that's probably one of the best tests that have been done to indicate the potential age of the shroud.
Okay, so we can kind of bring this to a close here, but I guess what would be what's your goal with getting this petition going, and like what ultimately do you hope to achieve? Why do you feel this is an important thing to kind of push for?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of the petition is to kind of get a groundswell going to bring to the top of the priority pile for the editors at Nature magazine to really re-look at this. And if we are able to get enough of a groundswell going, potentially get some of the other magazines and newspapers and other news sources to write about it, it may actually put enough pressure on Nature magazine where they will reopen this article and either append it or retract it. And we're hoping that we'll get there. We've gotten actually a lot more signatures than I was expecting. We're running about 400 right now, and we're hoping to get maybe 1,000. We're looking at then having a handful of scientists write a kind of I don't know if I'd call it a demand letter, but a retraction letter. In a friendly way, but a retraction letter to say, listen, here's what we believe is going on. We have the support of, all of these people in the public. We have the support of these top scientists and top groups within the shroud community, and we really want you to addend or retract that article. And here then are all of our scientific papers that lead to the fact that the radiocarbon dating done in 1988 led to an incorrect result. And so that's what's kind of on the purpose of the petition, GuyPowell.com/petition. And, for the audience, if you'd go out there and sign the petition, that'd be wonderful. And we will then let this unfold here over the next couple of months. And hopefully we'll be able to have some new news that we either failed or hopefully not, but that we were successful in getting at least some kind of a response, and hopefully leading to a full retraction of the article.
Yeah, so definitely for those listening now, if it'd be great if you would go to that link. I'm sure it won't take very long to do and sign the petition. Let's see if we can get that 400 number up a little bit. But I guess I'll give you a moment if there's any final things you want to share that you haven't yet. But I guess my last question would be kind of shifting gears a little bit here, but just back to the shroud, if it is authentic. I guess what does the Shroud of Turin mean for you? Because again, this is something that you put a lot of investment into. So the Shroud of Turin, if it is the authentic burial cloth of Christ, what does that mean, I guess, to you, and why is that significant? Why is it something that's worth us having conversations like this about?
Well, for me, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book is I want to bring. It's very hard to bring new people to Christianity. In the U.S., unfortunately, there seems to be a pretty big divide, but nevertheless, if I can convert just one person, that was my goal. If my book, The Only Witness, can convert just one person to Christianity, then I will have been a success. Now, in the meantime, I've gotten involved in the Shroud and a handful of different organizations, and I'm actually doing a presentation to. I wouldn't. Some of them are non-Christians, some of them are near Christians, some of them are Christians in India, and then hopefully another one in Kenya, where we're going to be presenting the Shroud as maybe a way to help convert people. And if we can do that, then then I've exceeded my goal of converting just one person to Christianity. So yeah, that's probably my last message, and hopefully for your
Yeah.
audience, if you're interested, and this might be a way to get you to make that final leap over to Christianity, feel free to reach out to me, guypowell.com. I'd love to talk to you further. If you've fallen away, I'd love to talk to you further. Maybe it's a way to do it. Whether you believe that the shroud is the true, authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ or not, hopefully the discussion that we're having can bring you over to Christianity, and that's kind of my final message. So, Jordan,
Yeah.
really, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you as well, and hopefully you'll get some more signatures on your petition after this. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.